The borders of Africa are strange in the sense they are not natural. Take for example the border between Germany and France. It was developed over the course of nearly 1,000 years of war, cultural change and revolution. Now look at the border between Botswana and Namibia. Notice how, compared to Europe, it's made up of just a few straight lines. This is because the borders of Africa were mostly drawn by European colonialists at the beginning of the 20th century. They didn't take into account any important factors such as cultural history or different languages. Because of this, it isn't difficult to understand why so many African nations have either collapsed or experienced civil war in the past 50 years. Today, I would like to look into a few of these failed states, as well as a delve into what the future of Africa may look like. The Somali Civil War is probably the conflict best known to most people in present day. Its origins date back to Somalia's defeat against Ethiopia in the Ogaden War of 1978. This led to great civil unrest, which resulted in a military coup under General Mohamed Siad, which remained in power until 1991, when he was overthrown by a group of rebels known as the United Somali Congress. However, the military junta's departure left a power vacuum within Somalia, and the once united rebel forces were divided into factionalism. Without a proper central government, Somalia was declared a failed state in 1992. The United Nations attempted to intervene and help establish some form of centralized government, organizing the United Task Force for operations across Somalia. However, they met stiff resistance from local warlords, and due to heavy casualties pulled out of Somalia in 1995. Since most of the fighting was being done around the capital in the south of Somalia, the northern part of Somalia, known as Somaliland, seceded and declared itself an independent country in May 1991. Even though Somaliland has its own currency, armed forces, government, and passport, it is not recognized by any other country, which is why you cannot see it on most world maps. In addition, Somaliland has its own history, having been colonized by the British, whereas the rest of Somalia was colonized by Italy. The two territories had been merged in 1960 upon their independence. Since the 1990s, the situation in Somalia has greatly improved, with the beginning of a transitional central government. However, some sporadic fighting does still continue to this day, as well as acts of piracy along the coast of Horn of Africa. It is yet to be seen whether or not Somaliland and Somalia will once again unite, or if Somaliland will assert its independence and become recognized as its own country. The story of the Central African Empire is crazy in of itself. It was a short-lived, self-proclaimed empire from 1976 to 1979. The story of its conception dates back to 1965, shortly after Central Africa became independent from France. General Jean-Bédil Bokassa staged a military coup on New Year's Eve 1965 to overthrow the president David Dachau. Bokassa declared himself president for life in 1972, but apparently that title wasn't enough for him. He went on to dissolve the government, convert to Islam, write a new constitution, convert back to Catholicism, and then he declared himself His Imperial Majesty as Emperor of Central Africa by will of the Central African people united within the National Political Party. A bit of a mouthful, and as you could probably tell, I couldn't quite memorize it, so he shortened it down to Emperor Bokassa I. Rather fittingly, French president at the time of Bokassa's rise to power, Charles de Gaulle, called him a bloody idiot. The coronation of Bokassa I is an entire video within of itself, but to make it brief, Bokassa spent $20 million on a party just for himself. That was about 1/3 of all the money the government made each year. I cannot stress that enough. 1/3 of all the government the money had was spent on just the coronation. Just imagine for a second that if Scott Morrison went barefoot bowling and had a chicken schnitzel, but he spent $114 billion on it. You'd rightfully be outraged, and so were the people of Central Africa. Bokassa only lasted a further 2 years in power before he was removed forcibly with support from the French military. David Dachau was reinstated as president, and the Central African Empire was dissolved. Rhodesia is, well, a far more complicated and controversial topic than Bokassa's empire. The Republic of Rhodesia was a self-declared country in modern-day Zimbabwe from 1965 to 1979. During the 1960s, decolonization was sweeping across Africa, and the minority white populations of British colonies were worried that they would lose all their power if native populations were allowed to form their own governments. Therefore, in 1965, the minority white government of British Southern Rhodesia declared itself independent and proceeded to institute apartheid. Understandably, the black population of Rhodesia were not happy about being segregated and oppressed. Therefore, they rose up, which led to the Rhodesian Bush War, which continued until Rhodesia's dissolvement in 1979. Because of Rhodesia's apartheid system, it was politically isolated from the rest of Africa and sanctioned by foreign powers. The only nation that openly supported Rhodesia during the Bush War was South Africa, which was the only other apartheid government in Africa at the time. Upwards of 20,000 people died during the Bush War, including numerous war crimes. Eventually, a resolution was signed between Rhodesia and the rebel group ZAPU, leading to a formal end of the Rhodesian government and a brief period of recolonization by British military forces from 1980 to 1982, when the territory officially became independent again as Zimbabwe. The East African Federation is a proposed union between 6 current African countries: Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, Burundi, Rwanda, and most recently, South Sudan. These countries all share a similar history and geography, as well as being very closely economically connected. When these countries initially became independent from Great Britain in the early 1960s, there were many propositions to form the East African Federation. However, none of them ever took off. That is until recently. Talk of forming the East African Federation started to pick up again in 2013. In 2016, the Ugandan president endorsed the idea, and in 2018, representatives from different regions came together to begin the drafting of a new constitution. It is expected to be completed by 2022, and the beginning of the formation of the East African Federation shall begin around 2023. As you can see, Africa has a complex and deep history when it comes to the assertion of its independent nations. In addition, it does appear that the future of Africa's borders are still yet to change. I must say though, I hope I don't have to buy too many new maps to stay up to date.